My name is Maribel Ojeda, and I am the Director of Professional Development. And you're in for a really great session today on English language instruction with Stephen Reid. Steve, will you advance to the next slide? Developing vocabulary effective strategies for adult English learners. I'll take you through a couple of housekeeping items. Go ahead, Stephen. Use the chat to introduce yourself if you have a resource or a link that you'd like to share, and ask questions. If you have questions about the content, we're going to stick with the Q&A, and so you'll see that at the bottom of your screen as well. Questions will be answered by the presenter or the ProLiteracy staff. Go ahead. If you have a technical problem, you can raise your hand, and a ProLiteracy representative will be here to help you. If you want to view the captions, you can click the CC, the closed captioning button at the bottom to view. You can also see the transcript and or the language, or change the language. Looks like we have a few hands up. I just want to suggest to put your question in the chat box, and we will get to you in just a moment. So we are recording, and you will receive a follow-up email with links to the webinar recording, the PowerPoint, a certificate, the chat, and the Q&A transcript, membership information, and scholarship information. We are doing something a little different with the coaching sessions. They're now small group workshop sessions, and it is an opportunity for Stephen to expand on the webinar topics from this webinar and to help you apply that topic to your own context. They are the week following the webinar, and they're limited to 25 participants per session. And it provides you with an opportunity to ask questions, share ideas with the presenter and other members of the group. Something I want to mention is that they're scheduled the next week to ensure participants can engage in job-embedded professional development. And it supports the immediate application of key concepts while getting the additional instruction from Stephen. We will put these links in the chat later and also send these to you. Workshop 1 is advanced vocabulary building. Workshop 2 is goal setting to boost vocabulary development. And 3 is integrating vocabulary building into lesson plans. Go ahead. As you know, we have a scholarship for New Readers Press. It's valued at $1,000, and the book sets for students and teachers can include Law Block Way to Reading, Journey to Success, and so on. The scholarships are limited, so you'll go ahead and click the link that is provided in the chat, and ProLiteracy membership as well as a resource. You get free 1-year individual membership for participating in a TTP webinar, and you'll receive that link in the chat as well. Deadline to apply for these resources is 11/5/24, November 5th. Go ahead. As you know, we have an election year, an election coming up. So please check out our easy-to-use interactive voting guide that comes to you from the weekly newspaper and website News for You. If you need more information, please check out our website. And now I will happily pass it over to Stephen Reid as he presents Developing Vocabulary. Thank you, Stephen.
Thank you, Maribel. Jumping back on something Maribel just said about that scholarship, one of the books in that series, the novel scenes and others that are similar to that, I am a big user of here at our center. We are fans. And so I definitely recommend that if you haven't gotten those and you're working with English language learners, that whole series has a bunch of great books in it that are engaging to readers who are just building their skills. And so definitely something I would recommend looking at once you get that scholarship. Here's my bio. I know that a bunch of you guys have been with me for the last couple of years, so I'm not going to go through who I am. But you'll see these, you'll get the slides later. And if you want to read about me and what we do here in Charlottesville, that'll kind of let you know what we're up to. So today, what we're going to be looking at, my objectives for today is I'm going to talk through the 4 different types of vocabulary, and then we're going to look at how that vocabulary is organized into 3 different tiers. And then we're going to look at the steps that you need to look at whenever you are going to be teaching vocabulary. And finally, we're going to look at some activities that you can use in your lessons, because I always like to provide some activities so that whenever you're taking these back to your center, you have some things that you can put into practice pretty much right away. But we're going to start by looking at the different types of vocabulary. And, we're all very familiar with the 4 different skills that we're looking for for our English language learners: reading, writing, speaking, listening. We talk about those 4 skills all the time. But how does that apply to the vocabulary itself? So that's where we're going to start, breaking down the reading, writing, speaking, and listening into the ideas of expressive and receptive vocabulary and oral versus print. So the listening vocabulary is an oral receptive skill. It's the skills that the sounds are coming into our brain, we're hearing them, and we're understanding when we hear them. In general, listening vocabulary tends to be one of the first skills that people develop. And think about if you've ever learned your own language, learned another language on your own. You have probably been to that point where you're like, okay, when I'm hearing people talk, I can pretty much get what someone is trying to say. I may not understand all of it, but I can kind of get the gist of what's being said. So that receptive oral skill is one of the earliest skills developed. And for many people, reading is another skill that comes pretty quickly, because when we see the word, if we have literacy in our first language, and as we're studying, we can see the word. When we see it, we recognize it and can understand. So the receptive skills do tend to develop a little quicker, particularly that listening skill. The speaking skills tend to take a little bit longer. Those expressive skills tend to develop a little bit slower. And I can relate this back to my own study of Spanish. I would say that I'm at the point where if someone is speaking to me in Spanish, I can get a fairly good idea of what they're trying to say to me. But if I try to turn around and speak back in Spanish, that's simply not happening. My ability to create sentences in Spanish is very, very limited. And so these are skills that tend to develop a little bit slower. And I'm sure you recognize this with your own students, that they could understand what you're trying to say, but they may not be able to answer you back as easily. And then writing is definitely the last of the skills that people develop. Being able to express ourselves fully in our first language is actually writing is the slowest skill to develop. And then, for most of us, we didn't really become proficient at writing in our first language into high school or in some cases into college. And so obviously that's going to be the skill that most people develop later in their journey into learning a new language. But vocabulary can be divided into three different tiers. Tier one is going to be those basic words, the words that you need for everyday life. In most textbook series, this is the vocabulary that comes through in like the basic book or the level 1 book. Sometimes you see a level 0 textbook depending on what the series calls it, but it's usually something like basic or foundation, and then into level 1. And so that's the vocabulary that you often see in those textbooks. If you're working with the National Reporting System, the NRS levels, those are levels 1 and 2. But heavily in level 1, but level 1 and 2 in NRS. For the tier 2 words, those are going to be higher utility, high frequency words. Textbooks wise, you usually see these in levels 2 and 3. They also, the NRS level 3, 4, but typically in the textbook series, you see it in levels 2, 3. And then the low frequency and academic vocabulary of tier 3, you often see in what is book 4, and sometimes it's called book 5, sometimes it's called transitions. And so those highest level textbooks are where you start seeing a lot more of that academic vocabulary. So tier 1 typically is the vocabulary that is most commonly used in spoken form. Most of the vocabulary has single meanings. As you all know, in English, we have lots of words that mean a lot of different things depending on how it's used in context. The tier 1 words tend to not be that. They are almost always the vocabulary that has just a single meaning. These tend to be a lot of the sight words and nouns, verbs, comment, adjectives. Nouns, particularly looking at concrete nouns, things you can touch and feel and pick up and move. So it's that type of vocabulary. And then verbs tend to be the action verbs, and then very common adjectives, color, size, and then comparisons, good, better, bad, worse, things like that. In general, this is about 8,000 word families in English. If you're unfamiliar with the concept of word families, that is the foundation level word and then any prefixes and suffixes that may get attached to it, usually that would change, either slightly adjust its meaning or change its part of speech. So like happy to happiness would be considered one word family. And so there are about 8,000 word families that are classified in this tier 1. So obviously, all of the tier 1 vocabulary is not taught in basic and level 1. We don't have students coming out of the level 1 books having 8,000 words of vocabulary in their heads. Not what we're expecting. But there are about that many words in the entire family, but the level tends to focus on just these tiers. Okay. So some examples of those tier 1 words. So tier 2 tends to be high frequency words that are used across a variety of fields. They may see these words at work, in school, in just general conversation. These are also going to be very important for reading comprehension. It's important that we have that our students pick up a lot of the tier 2 words in order to be able to read more fluently. So that's definitely important. Some of these words will have multiple meanings. And so that is something you're going to have to be thinking about whenever you're teaching tier 2 vocabulary. How does the meaning of this word change whenever we move from one context to the next? There are about 7,000 more words in word families that are classified in that tier 2. And so, to pick up these words, it's going to take a little bit more work to develop those tier 2 sets of vocabulary. And again, what we're looking at is words that you're going to see that are going to be more generally used across a variety of areas. Tier 3 vocabulary is where we're starting to see less frequency of the word usage. And they're going to be very, very specific to things like a specific school subject, hobbies, occupations, technology. All of you working in adult ed, you know how much jargon we have in our profession. And so it's vocabulary that makes total sense to us. But if somebody who is brand new to the program was hearing that, they're like, I do not know what those words mean. And the amount of vocabulary we have in tier 3 is astronomical. There are about 400,000 words in that are classified as tier 3. So that's something that we do need to keep in mind, that there is just a huge number of words that our students could potentially be exposed to. But in your classroom, you're going to have to keep in mind which of the words are the students going to most likely run into, and how can you help them develop that vocabulary. So when you're teaching tier 1 vocabulary, what you're looking at are common words. And in most cases, this is the easiest vocabulary to teach. You can use pictures, you can use gestures, you can use realia, bring in maps, bring in globes, bring in clocks, things to teach this vocabulary, things you can pick up and touch and manipulate and move around. And that makes teaching the tier 1 vocabulary very easy. I always say when I'm training new volunteers that the easiest part of working with a basic level student is the fact that the vocabulary you're working on is super simple. It's head and hand, and you point to them and you practice those over and over, and your student will pick those up. There's a lot of other challenges whenever you're working with somebody at that basic level, but the vocabulary is the easiest to deal with. And so these are just the common words that I think that most of you can teach fairly easily. In tier 2, things start getting a little bit trickier as far as how do we teach these. And I find that the most successful way for me to teach this vocabulary is using it in context. How is the student going to experience this word? What kinds of situations would they be in that make these words useful? And then I would also want to talk about the fact that there are going to be different times where a word may be a good choice and other times where it's not the best choice, or how the single word can change meaning in different contexts. So with tier 2 vocabulary, that is definitely something you have to keep in mind. I always try to start with the way the student is most likely to experience the word. So working with that first is the best choice. What's the most common way that the student is going to see this? And then after they are more comfortable with that, then we can pick up the others one at a time. I do not think it is a good idea to say, okay, here's a new word, and here are the 11 ways that it can be used, because that is going to overload them and bury them in vocabulary, and it's going to get to a point where they don't understand any of the meanings. And as opposed to if you just spent some time saying, this is the most common one, and we'll get to some of the others later. And over the course of a few weeks, you build up some of the other definitions. It is because we're looking at so much vocabulary, we don't want to overload our students with too much at one time. Tier 3 vocabulary is a bit trickier. If you are working in a one-on-one environment, you have the advantage of being able to just focus on that one student's goals. If you're in a classroom environment, you need to be thinking about how many students are in there and what are some general goals that they may have and that they may share. And so picking up that tier 3 vocabulary is a little trickier. If you are working in an IET program, integrated education and training, you have some advantages there because a lot of vocabulary you're going to be teaching in an IET is very specific to a workplace goal. So if you're working with people trying to get their certified nurse aide certificate, the vocabulary you get there is all tier 3 vocabulary, but everybody in the room has that same goal of passing that same test. And so you're looking at vocabulary that's very specific to the people in that room, which is one of the strengths of an IET program, is you can spend some time working on the vocabulary they need for that targeted career. Again, I think it's really important to spend time working on words in context. How is this word important for my student right now in the field that they are going into? And how does this word connect into what their learning goals are, looking at it specifically in context? And then thinking about how are they going to use this at work? If they're working on that IET program, how are they going to use this in that? If you're looking at something a little more specific, a little more general, for students who are thinking about how do we make appointments at a doctor and then what do we say when we get there, which is something that students from all backgrounds would have to do. And so in that case, what you're going to be looking at is, again, very specific tier 3 vocabulary, but it's open to a broader range of people. So all the students in your class in just a general advanced level class would all have the same type of vocabulary needs. So how do we go about teaching new vocabulary? So I think we have about 4 steps that we go through whenever we're going to be looking at a new piece of vocabulary. And we're going to start by introducing the word, and we write it. If your students are at the level where they're writing vocabulary, that's great. If we're still kind of building up to that level, that's okay too. We do the best we can with getting it down on paper if the student is capable. But the one thing that we do that is very important is we pronounce the word several times. I have the word few here, but I really think it's more several. We say the word over and over so that we get the pronunciation correct. We lock it into our students' brains from the beginning that the correct way to pronounce it, because it is very difficult to unlearn bad pronunciation. So I think it's very important that we lock it in from the beginning when they hear the word, when you are first introducing it, that we lock that pronunciation in and we get it very solid. And I think it's important that we spend a lot of time really drilling down so that we make sure that that pronunciation is clean and solid from very beginning. If we have to, that means we break long words into syllables and we tap out the syllables. We emphasize the stress syllable. We do whatever we have to so that they make sure that they are leading in with solid pronunciation, and we're doing whatever we can to practice that so that it is locked into place in the correct form from the very beginning. In step 2, moving into step 2, we are going to explain the word as clearly as possible using student-friendly language. And sometimes this can be a problem whenever we're looking at definitions of vocabulary. We have, we look up a word in the dictionary and there are then 6 words in the definition that we don't know. Then we have to go look up all 6 of those words to get back to the definition of the original word. So I think it's very important that you are using student-friendly language whenever you're defining the words. You need to make sure that they understand all the words in the definition and how they all fit together as you are explaining what the new word means. Excuse me. So I think it's very important that we really focus on how do we create a definition that my student is going to understand easily. And this can be a bit tricky, but I think it's very important that we do that. We don't want to go overboard on how many definitions we provide at one time, particularly right at the beginning. We want to make sure that they fully understand the word in its most common meaning or how it is used in the context of the lesson you're giving. And we don't want to dive in and learn too many definitions at one time. After they have a good understanding of what the word means, that's when you build on the definition. You can either have pictures, you can provide them or create them to help understand. Then you can go on to having your students create sentences to show usage, connect those words into real life usage. How are they going to use it in their daily life? And provide easy to understand examples or synonyms, what you can do to take it from being a little bit fuzzy of what that word means into a cleaner understanding of exactly how this word is going to be used and how they can use it in their regular life. From there, you want to engage your learner in more practice. So providing them with oral and written tasks, written if they are at that level that they can do that. So providing them with different activities to help them use that new vocabulary. Using it in practice using it in conversation. If you're working in a classroom setting, have them turn to the person at the desk next to them and practice using these in sentences or in dialogues so that they can spend some time working together. You can either have the students create the dialogues or you can create them yourself and work together on making sure that the learner is fully engaged with the new vocabulary so that as it is used more and more, they'll have a better understanding of the vocabulary. I think it's very important that we spend a lot of time really locking the vocabulary into place within the lesson so that as they progress and move forward, they have that word locked into place. I always say that every test in a new language is a comprehensive examination. Everything you learn from day one, you need forever. And so that's exceptionally true with vocabulary, that we need to lock that vocabulary in when they learn it so that it's with them forever. So there is some vocabulary that you need to teach actually all vocabulary you need to teach very explicitly. I think it's important that we spend time looking at vocabulary in every lesson, and certainly whenever you're moving into new units, that it's extremely important that we explicitly teach vocabulary and not just assume, well, they'll pick it up through context as we go. But I think it's important that we are looking at how many words that we're trying to teach at one time. It can get a bit overwhelming. And so I think an example of this, of teaching, be careful about teaching too many words within a language group. For example, if we sat down and taught all of the colors, all the names of the colors, and we're going to do all of that at one time, it's going to raise the possibility that they get kind of muddy, and we're not sure, is this yellow, is this green, is this orange, is this red, and not really remembering which word applies to which color, because we've had too many words come through at one time. And so we just need to be very careful about how many words within a language group that we're looking at. Any of you who have taken a biology class, think about learning the bones in the body. If you tried to learn them all at one time, you got 200 plus bones to learn all at once. And you're like, wait, is that bone in the wrist or is it in the ankle? And that's the same thing that happens to our students whenever we try to learn too much vocabulary at one time. When possible, I think it's a good idea to use cognates, which are words that have very similar sounding words in another language. For a lot of us, our Spanish speakers are a large population, and there are a tremendous number of cognates between English and Spanish. Be careful of false cognates. Those are vocabulary words that you think they're probably the same. They sound very similar, but they are not. They are not actually cognates. But like if you look at the drawing here, you see a lot of these words where the word is almost exactly the same or is the same. Salt to soul, you can see how that's the same. Soup to supa, zupa. And so you can get that, how that makes sense. But with Spanish, I think my favorite of the false cognates is embarrassed and embarazada. If any of you are Spanish speakers, you know that embarazada does not mean embarrassed, it means pregnant. And so something you have to be very careful about when looking at cognates. You want to make sure that it is actually a true cognate and not just two words that happen to sound the same that do not mean the same. I have been embarrassed many, many times. I have never been embarazada. And it's quite unlikely that I ever will be. And so that's one of those that you have to be very careful with, making sure that the cognate is indeed a true cognate. So I am a big believer in pre-teaching vocabulary. I like to start lessons with a vocabulary section. And so we spend some time. I will go through the vocabulary that is included in the lesson that we're going to learn, and I'm going to pick out all the new words, and we will spend time at the beginning of the lesson going through and learning all of the words that we're going to need in the lesson. Then, as we have moved into the lesson proper, they start seeing those words and they're like, wait a minute, we just covered these. I know this word. We learned this 10 minutes ago. And so that's a second exposure within the same lesson of getting that time to learn the vocabulary. It's that extra hit from beginning will help them learn it a bit more when they get further into the lesson. And you cannot review vocabulary too many times. In general, it takes 12 to 20 encounters with a new word for it to stick. That does not mean saying the word 20 times will have it lock into place forever. That's 20 different encounters. So different opportunities to learn and connect with the word for it to really lock into place. I'm sure that this is something that you have, that you're all, when I say it, it's going to be like, well, obviously that makes sense. You need to make sure you know the vocabulary that you're teaching, that you can define the word easily. But you also need to be thinking about, does this word always mean exactly the same thing? Does this phrase always mean exactly the same thing? Think about the difference between saying something is drop dead gorgeous and telling someone to drop dead. Not at all the same thing. you so you need to be very careful whenever you are looking at some of these phrases. Like, is this the way the student is going to encounter this in the world? Are these things, is it going to make sense? Are they going to be able to connect these? Slang is the biggest culprit in this situation because slang gets used in new contexts all the time. And so we have to be careful. Is this the right word for the meaning that we're using? I pulled this one out of an actual essay I received from an English language learner when the student got the definition to fancy someone means to like them. And he used the sentence, she fancies her uncle. I'm like, no, that's not what fancy, that's not the type of liking we're referring to in the word to fancy. And so we have to be very careful about the nuances of these. And it's like, no, she is fond of her uncle. She doesn't fancy her uncle. Very different meanings. And is there some nuance to it, which in the case of she fancies her uncle, to fancy, there is some nuance difference between to fancy someone and be fond of someone. Looking at vocabulary, for most of us, we're thinking of the word sick to mean physically ill. But in slang terms today, if someone says that movie was sick, that means it was a great movie, something they really enjoyed, and it didn't make them physically ill. And so that use of how vocabulary fits in slang is something that you're going to have to address with your students. But now I'm going to get you to a little bit of bad news. There is some vocabulary that must be learned by rote. And I am not a big proponent of learning by rote most of the time, but there are situations where it's just going to happen. Prepositions are probably the worst example because prepositions will not translate properly from one language to another. If you've been with me in other webinars, you know that I have talked about how prepositions aren't even consistent across English. And I'm not referring to English from the US versus the English of the UK. I'm talking about different parts of the US. Ask yourself, do you fill out a form or do you fill in a form? And the answer to that question is likely based on where you grew up. Different parts of the country will use different prepositions for the same phrasal verbs. So you have to be very careful on prepositions in general, and you're going to need to, these are just prepositions that you need to learn just by rote, because we have all those examples of we get in a car, but we get on a plane and on a bus and on a ship. And so those types of use of prepositions get particularly tricky, and a lot of those you're just going to have to memorize. Same is true for a lot of the conjunctions, the adverbs, adverbial phrases. Those get probably the hardest part of what we teach comes through this type of vocabulary. That a lot of you just have to learn it. You just have to memorize those words. So I think it's important for vocabulary in particular, but all new concepts, that we work with a timely repetition where we have reviews for new vocabulary at a set interval so that we practice the words a little bit many times so that the word tends to lock in. As I was saying earlier about the 12 different exposures to a word for it to really lock into place, it takes this timely repetition to get that to all lock in. I think it's a good idea to encourage your student to review the vocabulary that evening when they get home from your lesson. If they can just sit down for a few minutes and go through the vocabulary that night, the same day as the lesson, there's a greater likelihood that it's going to lock into place. And every time they hit that word again is how more likely it is. What I do in my lessons is I like to follow a 4-week pattern. So week 1, we learn the new material. And then week 2, we review it. Week 3, we skip it. And week 4, we revisit it. And then a few weeks after that, I try to refresh it again, if possible. And so in week 2, we are learning new material for that lesson and reviewing the lesson, the vocabulary from last week. In week 3, we're learning new vocabulary, new material for section C. We're reviewing B, and we're skipping off on the stuff from 2 weeks ago. Then when we get into week 4, we're learning the new material for section D. We're reviewing C, we're skipping B, and we're going back and looking at A. What I find is if I get them to that point in that week 4, and they're completely understanding the new words that we're referring to, that were from all the way back 4 weeks ago, they're like, oh yeah, I got this. Then it's theirs. They own it. It's theirs forever. It's locked in. If they're looking at me like this is brand new vocabulary that I've never seen before in my life, that means I need to go back and reteach this, and we're going to have to spend some more time reviewing it. And so a schedule like this, I find, is pretty useful to help me make sure that we're hitting the vocabulary enough times that the students are really locking it into place. So let's look at some activities that you can use in your class to help with learning the vocabulary. I think it's a good idea to assess your students' vocabulary with new words, because sometimes you have a word that you're thinking, yes, this is something that my student will definitely know, but they may not. Or it's like, this word's brand new, and I know they're not going to know it, but they do have some exposure to it after all, and so they know it a little bit. And I think these can kind of fit into 4 different categories. They could be the, I have never seen this word before in my life. I have no idea what you're talking about. The level 2 is, I've seen this word or heard it, but I am not quite sure what it means. 3 is, I'll recognize it when I hear it or see it, but it's not something that I can use on my own. And then level 4 is, I use that word, I know it, I use it, I'm comfortable with that word. And that's where we're aiming for all of our students. And so we need to be thinking about what we can do to help them figure out where their comfort level is with this. And there are different activities you can use, some matching or some multiple choice, to help them let you know what their familiarity with that word is. One of my favorite activities for learning new vocabulary is a word wall or a personal dictionary. If you've been with me for a while, you know how big a fan I am of these. Also, if you're not familiar with word walls, you can go back and look at my webinar on scaffolding, which was from the first year of Teacher Training Plus. And in that, I go into a lot of detail on how to build a word wall. And there's also a good article in the newsletter from Pro Literacy to help explain how word walls work. You can do these on paper, or you can do them on Google Docs. If you haven't seen that webinar on scaffolding, we can find a link for that to you. I know it's available on YouTube, and I'm betting there's a good chance that Danielle is working diligently to find that link, and she's going to end up putting it in the chat, because she's usually on top of things very quickly like that. Even though I surprised her with this one, and I should have mentioned this going in. I'm sorry about that, Danielle. So you'll be able to find that webinar on our YouTube channel. So you can do these on paper or in Google Docs. You can add as many columns as you want to help what you can do to help your student remember these the new vocabulary. Also things that are useful, things like vocabulary bingo, where you can create a bingo card using the new vocabulary that is coming up. There are some websites that, like this ESLactivities.com bingo, will help you create a bingo card. You can do it with pictures, or you can do it with words, and whatever is going to work for you and your students as you are trying to build these. There's going to be some links that you get at the end of the when you get the recording. There's some resources links that I have in there that you'll be able to see and jump to some of the activities that I'm mentioning, so you'll be able to get those links. I also think it's a good idea to play fun games. Just anything you can do to make the activity more fun, I think, is a good idea. Pictionary is always a lot of fun, particularly because nobody's expecting you to have great artistic skills, and that's part of the fun, is having the weird artistic skills, but using that to learn the new vocabulary is good. Hangman type games. I've always found that the idea of Hangman is kind of a strange thing to be teaching little kids, and I think it could also be a little uncomfortable for some of our students. So in the winter, you can build a snowman to get your to get to that idea, or an apple tree. So you have the trunk, the tree itself, and then a few apples to get to that point where they have missed out on the word. So some activities like that can be fun. As you are getting a little bit higher up in your levels, you can use matching or fill in the blank activities that you have, that when you start off, you make it a little bit easier, and you give them a word bank, and they match words to definitions, and the words are all there and the definitions are there, and they match it up. Then you get it a little harder. You put in the word bank, and they have to use the word in a sentence, and then you make it a little harder. You take away, you add extra words to the word bank that aren't used in any of the blanks, and then you make it a little bit harder, where you take away the word bank entirely and they have to fill in the word. And so it's something that, as your students get a little better, you can start taking away those the extra scaffolding to help them get to that point where they are comfortable using the vocabulary. And again, as we move further up, things like sentence starters are a great way to use the vocabulary. You give them a sentence that starts, most bad weather occurs during blank, and let them answer those questions in an open sentence format, so that they have to create more than just a single word that goes in the blank. They have to end the sentence. And then also taking it even further, where you give them the vocabulary and you're like, use this vocabulary to create 5 sentences, and they need to go in and figure out how to put those words together with other words that they already know to create the sentence. And that leads us to question time. So I don't know how much is in the Q&A just yet, but if you have questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A, and we will get to those momentarily. I do want to say, before we go into the Q&A, this is a QR code. If you will click on that QR code, that will take you to the survey for this session. And I can tell you that these surveys are extremely important, not just to me as a presenter, but also to ProLiteracy. We use the information from the surveys that you fill out to help us figure out what kind of professional development we need to provide in the Teacher Training Plus, and then what kind of things are actually better handled through ProLiteracy in a different fashion. And it also helps me as a presenter so that I'm getting better and I am doing what I can to provide the best material I can for you during these sessions. So I'm actually going to leave that QR code up so you can click on that at any point during the Q&A. But Maribel, what do we got in the Q&A right now?
All right. First question, how many words should you pre-teach before a reading passage?
In general, I think in a new reading piece, you should not have more than about 7 or 8 new words. I think 5 is great. If you get up to 10, you're pushing it. More than 10, I think, is overwhelming, and I would not at all recommend that. So 5 to 7, I think, is kind of a sweet spot.
Great. Laurice asked, is there a site to create these worksheets?
Actually, yeah, I don't have a specific one that I use, but there are a lot of worksheet creators online, and you can just go to Google and type in worksheet creator, and it's going to bring up a million possibilities. Many of them are free that you can just go in and it'll help you create the worksheets.
Is there a special cost for the TTP webinar series? No. Are there lists of tier 1 and tier 2 words available for download or in reference books?
Yes. Yeah, all you have to do is type in tier 1 vocabulary, and those lists are readily available.
Alan wants to know any hints on the vast number of irregular verbs. Wrote? Question mark.
Oh, English verbs. Just a never-ending source of joy for us and our students, right? So yes, unfortunately, that's another one of those that falls into the rote category because our irregular verbs don't, there are a few that follow patterns, but there are more that don't follow any pattern. And so trying to teach the pattern, it gets complicated because you're like, okay, we normally do it this way, but here are the 19 exceptions for when we do it a different way. So unfortunately, yeah, we're kind of looking at rote.
How do you choose what basic words to introduce to a 0-level learner for the first few meetings?
What do they need to know today? What do they need to know to get through for the first few meetings? If we are working on, from a level 0 student who we're meeting on day 1, look at the vocabulary you need to teach that lesson and things that they will need to know to get through today. And then, and I look at things like yes, no, and then I teach phrases like, can you repeat that? What is this called? Phrases like, or sentences like, or questions that, can you slow down? Can you repeat that? Can you spell that? So things that I want them to be able to do in the first lesson, I spend some time working on exactly those targets. Then as we are starting to build on that, as we're moving out away from that first lesson, then I start looking at more targeted vocabulary, but it's all going to be stuff that it's important for them today. Things that they need to use in their daily life for you know, immediate application. I think immediate application is something that we need to focus on with all of our students, but I think it's particularly true with those very, very foundation level students that we spend a lot of time on things that they can use immediately.
Speaking of pronunciation, Antonio said, do you give more importance to different aspects of a word? For example, pronunciation over comprehension, use in writing over use in speaking?
I would say I will give equal footing to pronunciation and meaning. Depending on the student, I will use it. I will focus more on use in speaking, unless I'm working with a really much higher level student, somebody who's in some sort of pre-academic track, up in that transitions level, those NRS level sixes that are going into like a pre-college, pre-university track. In that case, we'll spend a lot more time on writing, but for the most part, I will likely spend more time working on speaking than I will writing.
Excellent. With a student who doesn't have literacy in her native language, are there tips for teaching her basic learning vocab, such as match, read, write, etc.?
So yes, I think it's important that we spend some time looking at that vocabulary that's in the instructions, and if they don't have literacy in that first language, you're going to want to spend some time looking at teaching that very specific vocabulary, like what does it mean to match? And usually I will do this with like cards and the word apple and a picture of an apple, and I put them together. We match those, and so I think explaining the instructions is very, very important. But whenever we're working with those people who have no literacy in their first language, we do spend a lot more time looking at the foundations of how to learn. And if you go back and look at last year's my workshops from last year's Teacher Training Plus series, that entire year was spent on working with those pre-literate students. So if you go back and jump into those webinars, you'll be able to kind of get my thoughts on that. And if you do that and you end up with questions that come out of those, feel free to reach out to me via email, ell@proliteracy.org. And you'll be able to ask those questions. I'd be happy to help.
Excellent. How do you teach phrasal verbs, idioms?
Okay, so I do think having just some lessons on idioms, just single standalone lessons on idioms are fun because all languages do it, and it can be a really interesting and enjoyable lesson for everyone. So whenever you're talking about raining cats and dogs, and obviously there are not dogs and cats falling out of the sky, so we talk about what does that mean, and then have your student, what is the phrase that you use for a very, very bad rain in your language, and have them translate that into English, and it could be raining buckets or raining all kinds of things. And so turning that into a group lesson is a great idea. Phrasal verbs, I tend to teach as they are coming up in general, in the level that they're used in, based on what's kind of happening at that level in the textbook. And so I try not to overload them with too many verb plus adjectives on the same verb. If we look at turn on, turn over, turn in, turn up, turn down, that gets overwhelming if you do too many of them at one time. And so I try to just in time that instruction as well, so that we're not doing too many at once.
Great. Do you have time for 3 or 4 more questions, or would you
Yes,
like? Okay, excellent.
but not that many more because there's a
Understood.
yeah.
Okay, just let's do 1 or 2 more then.
Oh, do one or two more.
Um,
Yeah.
yep. So, how to nope. How important is it to teach body language, thumbs up, etc., during introductory lessons?
I think it's very useful because a lot of times that can come through and be put into practice right away, more so even than some of the vocabulary, because they may remember this as I'm happy and this as I'm not, more than they will be able to say, yes, I understand, or no, I do not.
And last question, someone asked in the chat when to move on with a mixed level group as all cannot learn well at the same rate. All classes are somewhat mixed level.
Right. Okay. So in a mixed level classroom, I think the first thing to do is make sure everybody's pronunciation is good, regardless of if they fully understand the word or not. When you feel like your lowest level students have at least a general gist of the new vocabulary, you can probably start moving on, but I would be careful about, you don't want to go racing too far ahead and lose half the class, but then you also don't want to keep drudging through something so that the higher level end of the class is bored because they got it too soon. Focus on the on the pronunciation, make sure pronunciation is locked in, and then the lowest level students, when they have sort of a gist, then you can kind of move on and then come back and work with them a little more individually whenever you get to that point in your lesson.
Excellent. So we are done with our question and answer session for now. All questions will be followed up via email. And we thank you for joining us today. The trainings will be linked on our YouTube playlist. If you have any questions, we look forward to hearing from you on the survey. Thank you.
Okay, thanks everybody.